This movie begins with Lizzie, one of the Bennet daughters, arriving home on a sunny afternoon. As she arrives home, she overhears her mom, Mrs. Bennet, talking to her dad, Mr. Bennet, asking Mr. Bennet if he is interested in knowing who bought the Netherfield Park. Mr. Bennet replies, saying she should tell if she wishes to. Lizzie smiles at this and walks into the house to find two of her other sisters, Lydia and Kitty, eavesdropping on the conversation between Mr. and Mrs. Bennet. As she tries to stop them from eavesdropping, their parents talk about Mr. Charles Bingley, who arrived from the north, who is rich and also single. So she gets interested, and the eldest sister Jane joins them to eavesdrop as Mrs. Bennet tells Mr. Bennet that Charles must marry one of her daughters and says he should go and visit him so that they can have a chance with him. His daughters also try to persuade him alongside Mrs. Bennet when he leaves the room, and he tells them that he has already visited him. Mary, the last daughter, keeps asking who they are talking about, as she seems lost. Soon enough, Mr. Bennet puts their minds at rest and tells them that he believes Charles will be at the ball the next day, and they all get excited at this except Mary, who is still confused. So, the daughters start to make plans for which clothes to wear to the ball. At the ball the next day, while the dance is going on, Lizzie teases Jane about how men will soon come looking for her. Suddenly, the music stops as Charles and his sister Caroline, and Charles's friend Mr. Darcy, who Lizzie says looks miserable, arrive at the hall. But one of their friends, Charlotte, says he is rich as he owns half of Derbyshire. Sir Williams, the host, takes them to the stage and the dancing resumes. Soon enough, Mrs. Bennet cajoles Mr. Bennet to take the girls to introduce them to Charles, which he reluctantly does. Soon after, Charles and Jane engage in a discussion about the library at Netherfield Hall and how much they love reading. Meanwhile, Kitty and Mary run to inform Mrs. Bennet that the army is coming to the village to be stationed there the whole winter. Right after, Mrs. Bennet seems excited when she sees Jane dancing with Charles. Lizzie goes to ask Mr. Darcy to dance with her, but he refuses. Some moments later, Charlotte and Lizzie overhear Darcy telling Charles to return to dancing, with Jane being the only one he considers beautiful, and that he is not attracted to Lizzie. What a beach slap to the face. When the music is paused, Mrs. Bennet talks about how Lizzie received the petty letter from someone they all thought was going to marry Lizzie. Darcy, who is nearby, joins this conversation and asks what it will take to develop an affection, and Lizzie replies by saying dancing will. Later that night, Jane and Lizzie discuss the events of the night, and Lizzie teases Jane after realizing that Jane is beginning to take a liking for Charles. The next morning, while they eat breakfast, the maid delivers a letter directed at Jane from Netherfield Hall. Jane opens the letter to see an invitation from Caroline to come and dine with her while Charles dines out. This shocks Mrs. Bennet and wonders why Charles will be dining out when Jane will be coming. Jane then asks to take the carriage, but Mrs. Bennet refuses to and says she will go on horseback. After Jane leaves, rain starts to pour heavily, and Mrs. Bennet seems happy about this and says that Jane will then have to stay the night there. Sneaky matchmaker mother. Soon enough, Lizzie reads out a letter written to them saying Jane has developed a cold and headaches, making Lizzie decide to go to Netherfield at once. At the hall, Darcy and his sister receive a notice about Lizzie's arrival at the house. When Lizzie arrives in their presence, she asks of Jane, and Darcy tells her that she is upstairs, so she leaves to see her at once. Seeing Jane, Lizzie pampers her, while she also thanks Charles for taking care of Jane as he comes into the room later on. Back at the house, while Mrs. Bennet is excited that Charles is already in love with Jane, Mary, Kitty, and Lydia run out of the house to see the regiment marching into the village. Lydia tells them that to get any man among them, they have to play the trick of dropping a property of theirs, and whenever any officer picks it, it means a sign of interest. So, Lydia drops a handkerchief, but one of the officers kicks it off instead, and she gasps. Back at the hall, Darcy talks to Charles, Caroline, and Lizzie about how he has not met many accomplished women in his life, judging by the ideas of music, dance, art, and painting. Caroline says Darcy has a high standard, and Lizzie teases him, saying he is proud, but he says those are just his opinions. Later on, while Charles, Caroline, and Darcy eat, they receive yet another notice of the arrival of Mrs. Bennet and the other girls. When they come in, Mrs. Bennet asks them if they want to settle in Netherfield Hall and if they are going to be holding a ball there, and Charles says Jane will decide the day when she fully recovers. As they leave, Darcy helps Lizzie to climb the carriage by holding her hands, which surprises her. Later on, Lizzie tells Charlotte that Mr. Bennet's cousin, Mr. Collins, will be visiting their house to pick a lady for marriage because he is to inherit Longbourn as the closest male relative. Collins visits them and speaks so highly of himself, while the girls secretly mock him. After eating, Collins privately tells Mrs. Bennet that he intends to propose to Jane, but she tells him that Jane is engaged already and that he can propose to Lizzie, which he says is a good alternative. On a later day, one of the lieutenants, Mr. Wickham, picks up Lizzie's handkerchief and gives it back to Lizzie as she and Lydia also approach him while on their way to get some ribbons. Wickham offers to follow them. At the store, Wickham then offers to buy Lizzie a ribbon, and they start to talk from there. On their way home, they come across Charles and Darcy, but Darcy leaves immediately after seeing Wickham. While they're alone, Wickham asks Lizzie how long Darcy has been there, and she tells him it's been a month. Lizzie, having earlier noticed the cold attitude between Darcy and Wickham, asks him if he is acquainted with Darcy, and Wickham explains how they grew up together and how Darcy's father treated him like a son, but Darcy got jealous of him and gave his rights after Darcy's father had died to another man, which has made him a foot soldier now. Meanwhile, as the Bennets prepare for the ball that evening, Lizzie wonders why Darcy would do such a thing. But Jane says she will ask at the ball. That evening, Collins also attended the ball while Charles welcomed the Bennets. At the hall, Lizzie looks for Wickham but comes across Collins, who asks to dance with her. While dancing with her, Collins tells her that he desires to be with her for the entire evening. After dancing with Collins and chatting away with Charlotte, Darcy interrupts them and asks to dance with Lizzie in the next dance, and she agrees. While they dance, Lizzie talks about how she and her sisters just formed a new acquaintance with Wickham and asks him about his lost relationship with Darcy, which she believes cannot be recovered. Darcy asks her why she is saying this, and she says she has heard different things about him. But Darcy says he hopes to afford her more clarity in the future. And then the dancing stops. On the other side of the hall, Mary plays the piano but is not good at it, and therefore gets interrupted by Mr. Bennet as he tells her to allow other girls to have a turn to play the piano. All this while Mrs. Bennet is ecstatic as she talks about her daughters getting married soon. After a while, Charlotte tells Lizzie to advise Jane to move fast and leave her shyness, as Charles is already in love with her. Collins on the other side is gathering up some courage to be able to face Lizzie, while Mary cries to Mr. Bennet about how she has been practicing all week, and he only consoles her. The next morning while they eat, Collins walks in and asks for a private audience with Lizzie. Mrs. Bennet, upon hearing this, sends everyone out of the room, including Mr. Bennet, whom Lizzie does not want to leave her. When they all leave, he proposes to her and tells her that he loves her and wants to marry her because, as a clergyman, he's already being pressured to bring in a wife. And since he will be inheriting the estate in Longbourn, he believes it will be an advantage to her family. But Lizzie rejects his proposal, telling him that they can't be happy with themselves, and leaves. Honestly, it's because he was too short for her. Mrs. Bennet, who has been eavesdropping on their conversation, runs after Lizzie and later comes back to meet Mr. Bennet to come and convince Lizzie to marry Collins. He goes to her, but contrary to what Mrs. Bennet was emphasizing, he tells Lizzie that he will stop talking to her if she marries Collins. When Lizzie returns home, she sees Jane in a sad state, and Jane gives her a letter from Charles. Afterwards, Charles, Darcy, and Caroline leave Netherfield Hall. Later that night, Lizzie speculates that Caroline must have lured Charles away from there, seeing that he is in love with her. So she asks Jane to go to their aunt's place and write him a letter from there, and he will surely come to her. But she should not give up on their love. While on the playground, Charlotte comes to tell Lizzie that she is now engaged to be married to Collins due to her age and the financial pressure she is under. Not long after, Lizzie receives a letter from Charlotte inviting her to visit her at her new home with Collins. On her visit, Lady Catherine de Bower, Collins' benefactor, invites them to her estate for dinner, and Collins and Charlotte tell her to put on the best clothes she brought. At the estate, they meet Darcy, who is Lady Catherine's nephew. While eating, Catherine asks her if she can play the piano and if she or any of her sisters can draw, but she replies by saying they can't. Later, Lady Catherine is amused by how decidedly Lizzie makes her opinions known while they talk. Soon after, Catherine asks that Lizzie play the piano for her, which she reluctantly does. Shortly after, Darcy comes to her and tells her that contrary to her opinion of him, he does not know how to talk with people. The next day, while Lizzie is home at Charlotte's place alone, Mr. Darcy comes in but does not stay long enough as he seems shy. This leaves Lizzie amused. During Collins' sermon, Lizzie gets to know from Darcy's friend that Darcy was the one who stopped Charles from getting married to Jane because he considered their family unsuitable. At a later time, Darcy meets Lizzie and opens up about how interested he has been in her and how he is willing to put aside his status and marry her. This statement from him infuriates her, and she bursts out and also tells him that she cannot be with him for ruining the happiness of her dear sister. He then explains that her parents' and sister's behavior warranted his actions, as it seems they only wanted the advantage that comes with the union. She also accuses him of his behavior toward Wickham, and he is surprised by the opinion she has of him, and he leaves, apologizing. The following night, Darcy comes to drop her a note addressing the sentiments she has against him. He tells her in the note that when his father died, his father left a generous life for Wickham because he loved him, which he gambled away within weeks and asked for more money. But Darcy refused to give him, and after some time, Wickham came to profess love to his 15-year-old sister, Georgiana, and tries to persuade her to elope with him because he knows that she is to inherit £30,000. Darcy writes that Wickham disappears when it is made clear to him that he will not receive any penny from it. Darcy tells Lizzie that concerning Charles and Jane, he did that in the service of his friend. Returning home, she meets Jane, who had returned from their aunts, and Jane tells her that she is over it already. Suddenly, their sisters burst into the room, with Lydia crying that she does not want to go to Brighton, as she is invited to go to Brighton with one Colonel Forsters. Lizzie begs her father not to allow Lydia to go, but he tells her that she needs the exposure, despite it being obvious that she will be leaving them. So, they all plan to go to Brighton, but Lizzie does not seem interested in going. Later that night, Lizzie tells Jane that she met Darcy at the Rosings, and Jane asks if anything was said about Charles. So she lies, saying no. While Lizzie follow her uncle, Mr. Gardner, and his wife to the Peak District, they stop by a lake close to Pemberley, where Darcy resides. So Mr. and Mrs. Gardner suggest that they visit his estate, and they all agree to, of course with Lizzie being reluctant to go. They arrive at the house, and Lizzie is amazed at all the furniture and sculptures she sees. She also sees a sculpture of Darcy, and she thinks he is handsome. As she continues to take a walk around, she spies on Georgiana playing, but Darcy sees her just in time and follows her when she runs away. They talk for a while, but she leaves soon enough after he asks her what she is doing there, and she tells her that she is with the gardeners. Later that night, at dinner, Darcy meets the gardeners to ask them to dine with him the next day, and he says that he wants Lizzie to meet his sister. They arrive back at Darcy's estate the next day, and Georgiana runs to meet Lizzie, excited to see her. Later that night, when they return from a day out with Darcy and Georgiana, Lizzie receives a letter from Jane telling her that Lydia has run away from Brighton with Wickham. Darcy then leaves, wishing he could help out. Back at home, Mrs. Bennet is feeling down, asking why the Fosters let Lydia out of their sight. Soon after, they receive a letter from their uncle addressed to their dad. They wait for their dad to come and get to read the contents of the letter, where he says Lydia and Wickham have been found and will get married if Mr. Bennet settles for £100 per year. This gets Mrs. Bennet up on her feet and excited. Later on, Lydia and Wickham visit Bennet's house. Wickham tells Mr. Bennet that he has been enlisted in the regiment, and they will be travelling to Newcastle the following week. Lydia then secretly tells Lizzie that it was Darcy who paid for their wedding and Wickham's commission. The next day, Mrs. Bennet receives news that Charles is coming to Netherfield the next day. Unexpectedly, Charles visits Bennet's house alongside Darcy. When they enter the house and exchange greetings, Lizzie asks Charles how long they intend to stay, and he says a few weeks for the shooting. So Mrs. Bennet obliges him to come to Longbourn to shoot as many as he can, and then they leave. Uncomfortable, Charles returns to the house and asks to see Jane alone. He apologizes to her and asks for her hand in marriage again, to which she positively replies yes. The whole Bennet family is happy that Jane made this decision. But later that night, Miss Catherine comes to the house to warn Lizzie not to get engaged to Darcy as he is to be engaged to her sick daughter. But Lizzie does not have any of this and sends her out of the house. Walking early the next morning, Lizzie comes across Darcy, who apologizes for his aunt's intrusion on her and expresses his unchanged love towards her, and she accepts his proposal. Later that morning, she tells Mr. Bennet about Darcy and how she now loves him after being wrong about how she felt about him before. Overjoyed at her newly found love, he gives Lizzie his consent to marry Darcy. Later on, Lizzie tells him pet names to call her on specific occasions as he pecks her all over her face. What a disgustingly cute movie. I hate my single life right now. What did you guys think?
Subscribe for more videos like this. Turn on notifications and leave a like. It really helps the channel.